Victor Brennan sat in the dimly lit living room of his two-bedroom house in Cedar Falls, Ohio, staring at another letter from the heirs. His construction company had finally collapsed. His business partner had disappeared with all their assets, leaving Victor holding the bag for unpaid taxes and angry creditors. Last week, his doctor had found an ulcer and warned about his blood pressure. And his son Alex hadn't returned his calls in 5 days. 55 years old, and what did he have to show for it? Deteriorating health, a bank account running on fumes, and a son who avoided him like the plague. Victor poured himself coffee from the coffee machine decaf now doctor's orders, and accidentally knocked over a cardboard box sitting on the edge of the kitchen table. His father's things. A month had passed since the funeral, and he still hadn't gone through them. He kept putting it off, as if afraid to touch this inheritance. Dad had died quietly in his small apartment across town, the one he'd refused to leave even when Victor offered to take him in. "Don't need to," the old man had said, and there was something hard in his voice, almost hostile. The box tumbled, contents spilling across the linoleum floor. Old photographs, a worn leather journal, a bundle of dried herbs tied with red thread, and an amulet accented a round medallion on a chain, covered in strange symbols Victor couldn't identify. The metal was dark, almost black, cold even in the warm kitchen. Victor picked up the journal. His father's handwriting small, nervous, as if the writer was in a hurry or afraid. The entries were dated across different years, some pages filled with incomprehensible symbols. But one phrase, repeated on several pages, made Victor freeze. "The bloodline is cursed. The men pay. Always pay." He remembered his father, a silent man, withdrawn, who rarely smiled and almost never hugged his son. In the rural Kentucky town where Victor had spent his childhood, people whispered about Dad. That Brennan's into some dark stuff, neighbors would say, not quite joking. His father had practiced folk healing, herbs and strange chants, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, people got better. Victor closed the journal. Nonsense. Superstition. But the amulet in his hand felt heavy, unpleasantly cold, and somehow he couldn't look away from it. The psychic medium worked out of a small office in a strip mall between a nail salon and a discount tobacco shop. Victor had found her on Yelp, hereditary spiritual healer, curse removal, generational trauma. He didn't really understand why he'd come. After a sleepless night with his father's journal, it just seemed like the only logical thing to do. The woman, maybe 60 years old, with dyed red hair and multiple rings on her fingers, barely looked at him. She took his palm, ran a finger across the lines, closed her eyes. "Generational curse," she breathed finally. "Heavy one. All the men in your bloodline are unlucky. Your father—" "Yeah," Victor said hoarsely. "There you go." He knew. Tried to fight it, but the curse is stronger. It passes down to your son too unless we break it. Victor's heart clenched. Alex. His smart, talented Alex, who worked at a tech startup and was building his career. Would he face the same thing? Can it be broken? Victor asked, and his voice sounded foreign, pleading. It can, but it's expensive. Takes time. Need rituals offerings. Victor paid $300 for the first session and walked out into the parking lot feeling like he'd finally understood what was wrong with him. It wasn't his fault the business failed. It wasn't his fault his health was failing. It was the curse. Generational. Something beyond his control. And this explanation brought a strange, almost sweet relief. Alex came over on Sunday reluctantly, and Victor immediately understood his son had only agreed to the meeting because his ex-wife had insisted. They sat in the kitchen drinking coffee, and Victor could see Alex avoiding his eyes. I've got important news, Victor began. I figured out why everything in our family goes wrong. Alex raised his eyebrows. Dad, if this is again about bad luck and circumstances. It's a curse, Victor interrupted. Generational. Your grandfather was into dark magic, you know that. He did something maybe in the war or before. And now all the men in the bloodline are paying for it. Silence hung in the air. Alex slowly set his mug on the table. You're serious? I found his records. It's all written there. And I saw a specialist, she confirmed it. Alex, this affects you too. You're under the curse. His son's face reddened. Dad, do you hear yourself? What curse of... What dark magic? Grandpa was just a messed-up vet who drank and didn't love anyone, including his own family. He was fighting the curse. Accented, he was a sick man. Alex jumped up. And you're turning into the same thing. The business didn't fail because of a curse, it failed because you invested in a sketchy scheme. Your ulcer is from stress and poor diet. And we don't talk because you're always complaining and looking for someone to blame instead of changing anything. You don't understand. No, you don't understand. Alex's voice cracked. I've got the most important project of my career right now. I need to focus, not listen to this crap about generational curses. He left, slamming the door. Victor sat alone in the kitchen, which suddenly felt very cold and empty. One thought kept spinning in his head. He doesn't believe. But the curse doesn't care whether you believe or not. Alex didn't call for 3 weeks. Victor didn't call either. Resentment and fear formed a tight knot in his chest. He kept seeing the psychic spending his last dollars on cleansing rituals, wearing his father's amulet around his neck. And with each day, he became more convinced, yes, it's a curse. Otherwise, why would the new job he'd finally found be so humiliating? Why did his stomach hurt worse? Why did life seem so hopeless? His son called late one evening. His voice was strange even, but behind that evenness was emptiness. Dad, can I come over? Of course. Alex appeared half an hour later, unshaven, in a wrinkled shirt. He sat on the couch, dropped his head into his hands. The project failed, he said to the floor. I made a mistake in the code. One critical error. They found it during the presentation to investors. I was pulled from development. They might fire me. Victor wanted to hug his son but didn't dare. Instead, he said, Alex, I told you. Don't. Alex raised his head, and his eyes showed confusion. Don't say I told you so. It's just, I don't make mistakes like that. Ever. I checked the code 10 times. But that day your words kept spinning in my head. About the curse. And I thought, what if? What if there really is something? Victor froze. Accented, and you know what's scariest? Alex continued quietly. When they were tearing into me at the meeting, I wasn't thinking about how to fix things. I was thinking maybe Dad was right. Those words sounded like a sentence. Victor looked at his son hunched over, lost, and suddenly saw himself. Saw how he'd looked the past month, pathetic, broken, hiding behind mystical explanations from the simple truth he himself had destroyed his own life. Not a curse, not his father, not fate. Him. And now he was doing the same thing to his son. Alex, Victor said, and his voice sounded firm for the first time in a long while. Listen to me carefully. There is no curse. His son looked up at him. But you yourself. I was an idiot. I was looking for an excuse for my failures and found it in nonsense. And now that nonsense is poisoning your life too. Victor stood up, took off the amulet, and threw it on the table. The metal clinked, and the sound was strangely ordinary. Accented, we're going to see a specialist. A real one, a therapist. And we'll figure out what's going on. Not with a curse, with us. The therapist's office was in a professional building downtown, bright and clean with plants on the windowsill. Sarah Mitchell, a woman in her 50s with attentive gray eyes, listened to Victor's story without interrupting. He talked about his father, the amulet, the psychic, the fight with his son. And with each word, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. Your father served in Vietnam. Mitchell asked when Victor fell silent. Yes. 2 tours. And after the war he was withdrawn, distant. Always was like that. I thought it was just his personality. That's post-traumatic stress disorder, the therapist said gently. Pubst, your father wasn't a warlock. He was a traumatized man who probably saw terrible things and couldn't cope with them. The writings you found aren't magical incantations. They're the attempt of a desperate man to find an explanation for his pain. Victor was silent. Something inside was slowly shifting, like a huge dam beginning to crack. He called it a curse because he didn't have another language for it. Mitchell continued. And what you inherited wasn't a curse. You inherited a pattern of thinking. A tendency to see yourself as a victim of circumstances. A propensity for depressive perception of the world. This isn't transmitted through magic, it's transmitted through upbringing, example, family atmosphere. So what? No. Victor exhaled. Now you've recognized it. That's already half the journey. The other half is work. On yourself, on your relationship with your son, on how you respond to difficulties. Not quick, not easy. But possible. Victor nodded. For the first time in a long while, he felt not despair, but something like hope. He and Alex sat in a downtown diner, one of those classic American places with red vinyl booths and unlimited coffee refills. His son looked better, he'd landed a new job, found another team for his project. You know, Alex said, stirring sugar into his coffee, I've been thinking about Grandpa. About what he was like. And I realized I barely knew him at all. Me neither, Victor admitted. He didn't let anyone get close. I thought he didn't love me. Now I understand he just didn't know how. You still seeing the therapist? Twice a week. And you know what? It helps. I'm starting to understand that a lot of how I lived was self-sabotage. I backed myself into corners, then looked for external explanations. Alex smiled. So the generational curse turned out to be a tendency toward negative thinking. Pretty much, Victor smiled back. But you know, in a way, that's even harder than magic. With magic you could fight with amulets and spells. Here you have to work on yourself every single day. But it works. Alex looked at his father seriously. You really have changed, Dad. You seem, I don't know, alive, I guess. Victor felt a lump in his throat. He reached out and covered his son's hand with his own. I'm sorry for what I said back then. For almost ruining your life with my nonsense. It's okay, Alex squeezed his hand back. The important thing is you stopped yourself in time. They finished their coffee, talked about work plans, life. An ordinary conversation between father and son, without curses and mysticism. And Victor understood this was the real inheritance his father had left him. Not amulets or writings, but a choice to repeat the patterns of the past or break them. Leaving the diner, Victor remembered the medallion. It still lay at home in the box with his father's things. Maybe he should throw it away. Or donate it to a museum if it was genuinely an antique. But it didn't matter anymore. Accented because the curse had been lifted. Not by magic, but by a simple human decision to stop being a victim and start living. Outside rain was falling, but Victor didn't open his umbrella. He walked beside his son, and for the first time in many years felt everything would be okay. Not because it was destined, but because they would make it happen themselves. The generational curse ended where responsibility began. And that was true freedom. At the next therapy session, Mitchell asked Victor about his father's war experience. They talked about how trauma gets passed down through generations, not through curses, but through learned behaviors, through the silent weight of unspoken pain. Your father probably came back from Vietnam with severe pest, she explained. Back then in the 70s, there was no support, no understanding. Men were just expected to tough it out. So he tried to make sense of his suffering the only way he knew, through the folk magic he'd learned from his own parents in Kentucky. He was trying to heal himself, Victor said slowly, understanding dawning. Exactly. And when it didn't work, because you can't heal psychological trauma with herbs and amulets, he concluded he was cursed. It was easier to believe in a curse than to face the reality that the war had broken something inside him that might never fully heal. Victor thought about his own failures. How he'd jumped from one business venture to another, always blaming external factors. How he'd pushed away his wife, his son, anyone who tried to get close. Just like his father had done. I did the same thing, he said. I ran from my problems and called it a curse. Accented, but you stopped, Mitchell said. And that's what matters. You broke the cycle. 3 months later, Victor stood in his father's old apartment, finally ready to clear it out. Alex had come to help. They worked in comfortable silence, packing boxes, sorting through a lifetime of accumulated possessions. "Hey, Dad," Alex called from the bedroom. "Come look at this." He'd found more journals hidden in the back of a closet. These were different, earlier entries from before Victor was born. Pages filled with his father's younger handwriting, still hopeful, still open. Victor read aloud, "Married Mary today. Happiest day of my life. Going to build a good life for us. Going to be the father mine never was." More entries fall. "Victor born today. Held him in my arms. Made a promise I'll protect him from everything. Give him everything I didn't have." Then, after a gap of several years, back from Nam. "Can't sleep. Can't stop seeing their faces. Can't explain to Mary what it was like. She tries to understand but she can't. Nobody can." The entries became darker, more desperate. "Something's wrong with me. I'm not the man I was. I'm failing my son. Failing Mary. There's a darkness in me now. Maybe it's in the blood. Maybe my father had it too." Victor's eyes filled with tears. His father hadn't been a warlock or evil. He'd been a broken man trying to understand why he couldn't be the father he'd wanted to be. "He loved you," Alex said quietly. "He just didn't know how to show it." "Yeah," Victor wiped his eyes. "And I almost did the same thing to you. Almost passed down the same pain, just with a different name." They packed up the journals, the herbs, the amulet. Victor would keep them not as mystical objects but as reminders of where he came from and of the choice he made to go a different direction. As they locked up the apartment for the last time, Alex put a hand on his father's shoulder. "You know what I think the real curse was," he said. "Not talking. Not asking for help. Thinking you had to carry everything alone." Victor nodded. "And the way to break it accented exactly what we're doing now. Being honest. Being there for each other." They drove back through Cedar Falls in the late afternoon light. Victor felt lighter than he had in years. The generational curse, the real one, made of silence and shame and untreated trauma, was finally broken. Not by magic, by truth, by the simple, difficult work of healing. And that, Victor thought, was the best inheritance he could give his son. Not the absence of pain or struggle, but the tools to face them. The courage to ask for help. The wisdom to know that being vulnerable wasn't weakness. It was the only real strength there was.